So we've spent a lot of time talking about the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. What were the political events that affected these kingdoms? What are the history of these kingdoms? What I'd like to do now is turn to consider some aspects of everyday life in these kingdoms, focusing specifically on fortifications and on cultic practices, that is, the religious practices of the populations of these kingdoms, and what do we know about that through archaeology. So what I'd like to do is start by looking at fortifications. Well, first of all, one of the most distinctive features of the biblical landscape are artificial mounds called tells. Most people are familiar with tells from reading books like James Michener's The Source, which actually is the story of an excavation through a kind of a made-up or imaginary tell, one of these artificial mounds. And most people think that tells are formed by accumulations of one city on the other, that is, building a city over and over again in the same spot, which creates this sort of artificial mound, so that eventually you get a big, tall kind of a hill, which basically consists of layers of one city on top of the other. That's what most people think a tell is. Now, that's actually only partially true. It is true that a tell is made up of layers of occupation, one on top of the other. But it's not just the building of one city on top of another, because when you think about it for a minute, tells are found in various parts of the ancient Near East, in Palestine and in some of the surrounding areas, but they're not found in other parts of the ancient world. Have you ever seen a tell in Italy? Have you ever seen a tell in other parts of Europe? Or, for that matter, elsewhere in the world? Weren't there other places around the world where you have continuously occupied spots, where cities existed for centuries and even millennia, one on top of the other? Why don't we have tells in those places? So the fact of the matter is, a tell is not formed just by layers of civilization, one on top of the other in the same spot over the course of a long period, but they're formed specifically because of something else that we find only in certain parts of the ancient Near East, and that has to do with fortifications. Specifically, in the Bronze Age, a certain type of defensive system became common in certain parts of the Near East. This kind of defensive system is called a glacis. What it consists of is digging a dry moat around your town or village and using the dirt from the moat, piling it up into a tall hill that surrounds your village, so that either your village is in a crater surrounded by this tall hill, or your village sits on top of it. And the entire thing then is surrounded by a fortification wall. So what you have to imagine then is, if you're coming to one of these towns or villages that is surrounded by this kind of glacis system, you would come up, you would have a big dry moat or a big dry ditch, and then a kind of a steep slope plastered over to hold the dirt in place, and then at the top of that steep slope, you would have fortification walls, and the city or the town would be inside that. Tells are formed specifically by this kind of fortification system, and it was the fortification system, the glacis, which kept the layers of debris, the layers of occupation, as they accumulated over the centuries within this form of a tell, which actually formed the tell. So, cities or towns that were fortified or established after this kind of fortification system went out of use do not have the form of a tell. For example, Caesarea Maritima, a classical site that we'll be spending a lot of time talking about, is not in the form of a tell, even though it was occupied for centuries, because Caesarea was not established until long after the glacis system of fortification had become obsolete. Now, one of the interesting things, by the way, about this kind of glacis system is why, in fact, did it appear? Whenever you see a certain type of defensive system introduced, it always reflects the answer, the response to the introduction of a particular type of offensive warfare. So scholars debate, well, what kind of offensive warfare was the glacis built in response to? Was this kind of defensive system built in response to? Well, let's look at it for a minute. You have this very steep plastered slope that's very smooth and slippery with the city wall on top. It could be a response to several things. One possibility that it's a response to battering rams, because it would be very difficult to get a battering ram up to the top in order to break through the city wall. Another possibility, it was introduced in response to the introduction of the horse and chariot. Very hard to get your horse and chariot to climb up that steep, smooth slope. Another possibility, it was in response to mining. That is, the idea is that you made it hard for the enemy to dig underneath the city wall, the fortification wall, and thereby cause the wall to collapse and enable the enemy to get into the fortifications. So basically, the glacis then is a type of defensive system that is introduced in response to a specific type of offensive system of warfare. And anytime you see a tell in the Near East, you know that that site has this kind of fortification system. Now, the walls which surrounded the top of a defensive system like the glacis, these city walls, of course, had to have gates in them because you have to allow for people to get in and out. And gates were always the weakest part of a defensive system in any city. The gate's the easiest place to get into, and so there's always a concern with making sure that your gate is very well fortified. So you fortify it with towers, for example, so you can post people to fire down on anybody who's trying to approach to the gate, and so on and so forth. Well, in the Israelite period, that is, under Israelite rule, we have a very particular and distinctive kind of gateway system that is found at several sites. In fact, this kind of gateway system is found at 3 sites that are known to have been fortified by King Solomon. And the late Yigael Yadin, the great Israeli archaeologist who was also chief of staff of the Israeli army and was very interested in military history and ancient warfare, he's the one who noticed that we have a correspondence between the same kind of gateway found at 3 sites that are found in Solomonic levels and a passage in the Hebrew Bible which describes Solomon fortifying these 3 sites. Specifically, the passage is from 1 Kings, and it reads as follows. Solomon used foreign labor to build the house of the Lord and his own house, the Milo, and the wall of Jerusalem, Hatzor, Megiddo, and Gezer. Notice the last 3 sites, Hatzor, Megiddo, and Gezer. All of these we've talked about as originally having been Canaanite sites that eventually then were settled by the Israelites. And in this biblical passage, Solomon fortifies all 3 of them. And he noticed that at all 3, we have identical types of gateways in levels that can be associated with the time of Solomon. Now, this particular gateway is very interesting because what it consists of is a passage that is flanked by a series of rooms on either side, specifically 3 rooms on each side of the passage. In fact, this kind of gateway also seems to be alluded to in the book of Ezekiel, where it says, quote, there were 3 recesses on either side of the east gate. The 3 were of the same size. So what do we have here? How did this kind of gate operate? What is the sense in this kind of gateway? First of all, let me mention what we're actually looking at in terms of archaeological remains are the foundations, the stone foundations of the gate, and the rest of the gate either would have been built of stone that has not survived or of other materials such as mud brick. In fact, at Tel Dan, we have a complete surviving mud brick example of a gate that's very similar to this type of gate where the mud bricks were buried later on and so were preserved. Ordinarily, mud bricks are not preserved, but at Tel Dan, in this case, because of the circumstances, the mud bricks of the rest of the gate above the foundations were preserved. We also have an Iron Age gate at Arad, an Israelite period gate at Arad, that is very similar to this type of gate, which has the chambers flanking the central passage. So what is the sense of this? Well, what you have on the outside of the gate are 2 towers projecting, so you could station your soldiers and maybe artillery or whatever, to fire down on anybody who's trying to approach. And then you have the actual passage itself with the 3 chambers on each side. Now, what is the sense of the 3 chambers? The chambers are created by walls, projecting walls that come out. So you have a chamber, walls here, next chamber, walls, next chamber, walls. The projecting walls that create the chambers were places where there were originally doors. You have to imagine big, heavy wooden doors, maybe covered with metal or something like that, but big, heavy wooden doors. So the idea here is that you are setting up a series of successive doors that can be shut. So 1 door, 2 door, 3 door, 4 doors, 4 successive doors, one after the other. So if you have an enemy attacking your gate, and let's imagine that they've hauled up a battering ram and they're trying to batter through the gate, so they get through 1 door, and then guess what? They got another one they got to batter through, and they get through that, there's another one. You've set up a series of barriers, one after the other. Not only that, but in the chambers, in the rooms between the doors, you can have soldiers waiting so that if they manage to get through one of the doors, the soldiers are there to attack them and to keep them from going any further. So it's a defensive measure. So these gates, in other words, were created in a way that protected, defended as strongly as possible the gate, the entrance to the city, which by definition is always the weakest part of the city's defenses. Now, one example of a gate of this type is found at Arad. Arad is a biblical site that is located in the southern part of the country. In fact, it's in the northern Negev desert. There's a much earlier site at Arad from the early Bronze Age, but what we are interested in is an Iron Age fortress at Arad. So at Arad, in the Iron Age, in the Israelite period, there was a fortress. Why was there a fortress at Arad, by the way? This was at the southern part of the biblical kingdom, and to the south, much further south, of course, was Egypt. So we're basically looking in a kind of a frontier area here when we talk about Arad. So at Arad, we have a fortification system with a gateway similar to the type that we just looked at, but there's actually something even more interesting in the Israelite fortress at Arad, and that is a sanctuary. A sanctuary that was built around the 10th century BC, which means that it's built somewhere around the time of Solomon or maybe a little bit after Solomon, and which existed then for the next couple of centuries. Because Arad was an Israelite site located in Judah, what we have here then is an example apparently of a sanctuary outside of Jerusalem in the kingdom of Judah that is dedicated to the worship of the God of Israel. This is something that we talked about in the last lecture, this idea of centralization of the cult versus decentralization of the cult. The cult of the God of Israel was not always centralized in Jerusalem. There was a time when there were sanctuaries and shrines around the countryside, not only in Israel, but also in Judah. And what we are looking at here at Arad is one of these countryside sanctuaries dedicated to the God of Israel. So what did the sanctuary here consist of? Well, it actually consisted of a series of 3 elements, one after the other, starting first of all with an open courtyard that had an altar located in it that we will talk about, and then 3 rooms. Number 1, a hall, or a broad room. A broad room means that the access is along the width rather than the length. A sanctuary consisting of a room with a small niche in it, and the niche faced west, and the niche itself, which was apparently the Holy of Holies. So let's take a look now at the altar in the open courtyard. So before you have the actual 3 rooms, you have this open courtyard with an altar, and the altar at Arad measures 5 by 5 cubits. It's a square, which is about 2.5 by 2.5 meters. And it was made of bricks, mud bricks, and unhewn field stones. That means stones that were simply picked up off of the ground and not cut at all. They're not cut at all. They're just taken as they are and built into the altar. And the upper surface of this altar was plastered and had a channel to drain the blood of the sacrifices. Now, what's very interesting is that the way that this altar is constructed corresponds with the biblical injunction about building altars of unhewn stones. Specifically, Exodus says that altars to Yahweh must be built out of unhewn stones, quote, "For if you use a chisel upon it, you profane it." So in other words, this altar in the Arad temple is built in accordance with the biblical law that we see in Exodus. What do we see in the temple itself? The 3 successive rooms, with the innermost room being this little niche that faces west, that is apparently the Holy of Holies. In this niche, we see 3 steps that led to a raised platform. On top of the platform, there were stelae, standing stones, not carved with anything. They didn't have any inscriptions or designs on them. What is called in Hebrew matzeva. A matzeva is the Hebrew term for a stele. Matzevot is the plural. And this, by the way, recalls something that we looked at way back when we talked about the Canaanites and their worship and looked at Hatzor and saw a shrine dedicated to the moon god with a bunch of standing stones. This is very common in the ancient Near East, and especially in the area of Palestine, to erect these sort of stelae depicting apparently or referring to different gods, intended to symbolize different gods. And one of the stelae was still plastered and painted red. In addition to the stelae at the top of the platform, there were 2 incense altars made out of stone on the lowest step. And burnt organic matter was found on top of these stone incense altars, so they were actually used. So the sanctuary here at Arad was constructed in the 10th century BC, so roughly around the time of Solomon or maybe a little later, and it continued to function for a couple of hundred years. In the late 8th century, the altar went out of use, and this may be connected with Hezekiah's reforms. So Hezekiah's attempts to centralize the cult, it may be at that time that the altar in the Arad temple went out of use. And then in the 7th century, the sanctuary was destroyed altogether, and this apparently is connected with religious reforms instituted by one of the kings of Judah, whose name was Josiah. And now what I'd like to do is consider what do we mean when we talk about Josiah's religious reforms. Exactly what did Josiah do? Well, Josiah was the king of Judah from about 640 BC until the year 609 BC. He is credited in the Hebrew Bible with instituting a reform that is described as the Deuteronomistic reform. What do we mean by Deuteronomistic? It is the reform associated with the introduction of laws recorded in Deuteronomy, the last of the 5 books of Moses. The term Deuteronomy actually is a Greek term, which means the second law, because what Deuteronomy does, what this book of Deuteronomy does, is it actually reiterates or repeats many of the laws that appear in the earlier 4 books of Moses. Well, one of the points of the Deuteronomistic reform was to eliminate the worship of other gods, that is, to institute absolute exclusive Yahwism, and to centralize the cult of the God of Israel in the Jerusalem temple. That is, to eliminate all of the countryside or all of the shrines and the temples that were located in the countryside outside of Jerusalem, such as the one that we just looked at in the Arad fortress. How did Josiah actually do this? According to the biblical description, what he did was institute these reforms as the result of a discovery. The story goes that he was having repairs done on the Jerusalem temple, and in the course of repairs, a priest found a previously unknown book, one of the 5 books of Moses, a previously unknown book of law, and this then is the book of Deuteronomy. And as 2 Kings says, the high priest Hilkiah informed the scribe Shaphan, remember, by the way, Gemariah, son of Shaphan, I have found the book of law in the temple of the Lord. So what happens then, the story goes, is that they bring the book out, they read it to the people, and one of the points of this is then to institute these reforms, centralizing the cult in the Jerusalem temple and eliminating the worship of other gods other than the God of Israel. And so, as 2 Kings says, he, Josiah, put an end to the false priests whom the kings of Judah had appointed to burn incense on the high places in the cities of Judah and in the vicinity of Jerusalem. So, according to this account then, Josiah eliminates the sanctuaries and shrines that are outside of Jerusalem and also in the vicinity of Jerusalem, leaving only the Jerusalem temple. And it's apparently against this background then that the sanctuary at Arad that we just looked at, that temple at Arad, is destroyed in the 7th century. Now, we also have other evidence for an Israelite cult in the form of horned altars. Horned altars have been found at a number of sites, for example, at Beersheba and at Megiddo. And this is very interesting because we also know about horned altars from the Hebrew Bible. For example, according to biblical law, it was permitted to seek sanctuary in a sacred place. So if you were a refugee seeking sanctuary, you could seek sanctuary and be safe if you went to, let's say, a temple. And so in 1 Kings, we have a description, a reference to Solomon's older brother, Adoniah, and Joash, David's general, quote, grasping the horns of the altar, end of quote, in the tent of the Lord when they feared deadly retribution from Solomon. So here we have a reference to people seeking sanctuary in, quote, the tent of the Lord by grasping the horns of the altar. And lo and behold, we actually have archaeological remains of horned altars from Israelite contexts. Another example of correspondence between archaeological discoveries and biblical descriptions of religion is a discovery from a late Iron Age tomb in Jerusalem. That is a tomb that dates to the 7th century BC in Jerusalem. It's a rock-cut tomb. We will be talking about rock-cut tombs a lot more later in the course. Specifically, this is a tomb that is located northwest of the city of Jerusalem, outside the walls of the ancient city, at a site called Ketef Hinnom. This is a tomb that was discovered and excavated in 1980 by an Israeli archaeologist, and in fact, it's the only example of an ancient tomb in Jerusalem that was discovered by archaeologists unplundered. So it still had all of its original goods in the tomb. It hadn't been looted by anybody. And among the objects that were found in this tomb were two tiny little silver amulets, very thin beaten sheets of silver that were rolled up in the form of teeny little scrolls, which probably were originally worn as amulets, either maybe as a necklace or a bracelet or something like that. And when these little silver amulets were unrolled, they were found to be inscribed in biblical Hebrew script and in biblical Hebrew language. One of them is inscribed in part with the priestly benediction that is known from the book of Numbers. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. So this little passage, which is called the priestly benediction, is inscribed on one of these little silver amulets, which dates to, let's say, around 600 BC. It is the earliest example that we have of an object inscribed with a passage that is included in the Hebrew Bible. So very close to the time the Hebrew Bible was actually being edited and written down, this inscription is found on this silver amulet. Well, one of the most intriguing archaeological sites that we have related to cult and religion from the Israelite period, from the Iron Age, is a site called Kuntilet Adrud. Kind of a strange name to remember, but anyway, that's the name of the site. It is a small site that dates to the early 8th century BC, so a little after 900, located in the northern Sinai. So it's really pretty way out there compared to the other sites that we've been talking about. It's much farther away, northern Sinai. Exactly what is this site? It's been excavated. It seems to have been some sort of a religious center, maybe a wayside shrine, maybe caravans sort of going by. People would stop here and there was some sort of cult or worship going on here. And the nature of the finds at Kuntilet Adrud suggest strong ties with the northern kingdom of Israel. And so perhaps this wayside shrine was established by one of the kings of Israel. So what do we have from Kuntilet Adrud that's so interesting and so connected with religion and cult? Well, the finds include plaster that was on the walls of the buildings that are painted with different kinds of figures that we're going to look at, pottery vessels that are inscribed with Hebrew inscriptions and drawings. And by the way, clearly then we're talking about an Israelite population here at the site because the inscriptions are in Hebrew. Here are some of the drawings that were found on large jars called pithoi. And what they include are two figures resembling the Egyptian god Bes, which are sort of these kind of almost grotesque figures, with a lyre player nearby, and 5 figures raising their hands in prayer. In addition to the figures resembling the Egyptian god Bes and the lyre player, there is also a cow licking the tail of a calf. The Hebrew inscriptions on the wall plaster and pottery vessels from Kuntilet Adrud include a whole series of very, very interesting and somewhat puzzling inscriptions. So, for example, "Your days may be prolonged and you shall be satisfied. Give Yahweh of Teman and his Asherah, Yahweh of Teman and his Asherah favored. And when El rose up and hills melted and peaks were pounded, bless Baal in days of war, the name of El in day of war." Ashio the king said, "Tell X, Y, and Z, may you be blessed by Yahweh of Shomron," that is Samaria, "and his Asherah." Well, what does this all mean? Well, this is very interesting because remember, this we see here apparently reflects northern influence, and we have a reference indeed to Samaria here. Remember the principle of inclusive versus exclusive Yahwism, that you may worship Yahweh but also other gods alongside him. And that seems to be what we see here. So we have references not only to Yahweh, to this deity who was the God of Israel, and by Israel I mean the God of all of the Israelite tribes and their descendants, but also references to other deities. For example, something called an Asherah, which we'll talk about in just a minute. Notice a reference to Baal, the Canaanite deity, and very interesting, the name El. Now, El actually occurs as the name of the God of Israel, as a name of the God of Israel in the Hebrew Bible. But El was also